5 days ago, this reservoir hit the lowest level it has ever been, Lake Mead, 1,039 feet, not the lowest this year. The lowest since the day it was filled, in the 1940s. 40 million people drink from this river. It grows most of the vegetables Americans eat in winter. And on the 14th of August, it quietly set a record nobody celebrated. Now go about 4 hours southeast to the edge of Phoenix, a place called Rio Verde Foothills. Around 2,000 homes scattered across the desert. No water mains reach it. There is no pipe. There never was. For years, hundreds of those households simply bought water by the truckload. The trucks filled up in Scottsdale, the wealthy city next door, and drove it out. On the 1st of January 2023, Scottsdale stopped selling. It was not a punishment. Scottsdale had been warning them since 2015. The city's own supply comes from the Colorado. It decided it needed to keep it. So the trucks started driving further and the price went up. In some cases, it tripled. People flushed their toilets with collected rainwater. They ate off plastic plates so they would not have to wash up. Some of them bought gym memberships so they would have somewhere to shower. And the drivers queued at a remote public standpipe, feeding at quarters. 2,000 households. 40 minutes from one of the richest metro areas in America. So here's the question this film answers. When there is not enough water for everyone who was promised some, who decides who goes without? The answer is not really the government. It is a stack of paper going back 100 years. And every sheet in it has a date on it. Because nobody in America owns the water. People own the right to take it. And that right is property. It can be bought, sold, inherited, borrowed against. So the real question is not who owns the water. It is who owns the paper. 4 weeks ago, the rules that decide all of this ran out of road. 7 states spent 3 years failing to agree on what replaces them. So on the 31st of July, the federal government stopped waiting and wrote the rules itself. The old rules die on the 31st of December. And the people holding the oldest and largest claim on this river are the ones most likely to end up with nothing. A claim to a quarter of everything in it. Keep them in mind. We come back to them at the end and they turn out to be the whole story. The system that runs water in the American West has a name. Prior appropriation. In plain words, first in time, first in right. Whoever put a pipe in the river first has the strongest claim to it. Not the biggest town, not the most people, not the most useful crop. Whoever got there first. And the date sticks. To the land, to the deed, and through every sale after. A claim filed in 1896 still outranks a claim filed in 1968. So when the river runs short, it does not shrink for everybody. It shrinks from the bottom of the list upwards. The junior right goes to 0. The senior right does not lose a drop. That is the whole mechanism. That is who decides. A queue, ordered by date, written down before almost anybody alive today was born. Think of it less like a public utility and more like a share register. Everyone holds a certificate. The certificates are ranked, and in a bad year, the bottom of the register is simply wiped out while the top is untouched. Which raises the obvious question, who is at the top? Not Los Angeles, not Phoenix, not Las Vegas. The single largest holder of Colorado River water on Earth is an irrigation district in the California desert, in a valley most Americans have never heard of. The Imperial Irrigation District, 3.1 million acre-feet a year. Quick translation, because acre-feet are a genuinely unhelpful unit. 1 acre-foot is an acre of land under a foot of water, roughly what 3 American households get through in a year. So Imperial's annual entitlement, on its own, is a bigger claim on the Colorado than the entire state of Arizona holds. 1 irrigation district, around 500,000 residents in the county, a larger share of the river than a state of 7.5 million people. Now, Here is the part that reframes everything else in this film, and it is worth stopping on properly. Ask what that water costs. Researchers at UCLA published a study last December that went through the actual payments, not the theory, the invoices. They found 5 large agricultural suppliers that paid the federal government nothing at all for close to 4 million acre-feet of water. Nothing. Not a discount, not a subsidized rate. 0. And 3 of them draw from the Colorado, Imperial, Coachella Valley, and Palo Verde. Cities in that same lower basin, taking water from the same river in the same year, pay on average more than $500 for an acre-foot. And in 2018, one town in Arizona went out and bought water on the open market and paid about $11,800 an acre-foot. 0, 500, 11,800. Same river, same water, same year. A spread of roughly 400 times between the cheapest and the most expensive claim on an identical physical thing. That is not a market working badly. That is 3 entirely separate systems of value stacked on top of one river: a historical entitlement, a public utility, and an asset market. And none of them can see the other 2. Everything that follows in this film happens in the gap between those 3 numbers. The lawsuits, the Saudi farm, the hedge funds, the federal takeover in July. All of it is pressure trying to escape through that gap. To understand how a country ends up here, you have to go back to the room where the numbers were invented. 1922. 7 states send representatives to a lodge in New Mexico to divide up a river none of them had ever properly measured. They needed a total. How much water does the Colorado actually carry in a year? They had roughly 2 decades of gauge records, so they used them. Those records suggested something close to 18 million acre-feet, so they allocated 16.5 million between the states, and later arrangements pushed the total promises past 17. And on the face of it, that was cautious. Allocate less than the river carries. Keep a margin. Except for one thing. The 2 decades they had measured were the wettest stretch that river had seen in centuries. We know that now because of trees. From the 1940s onward, scientists began reading tree rings across the basin. A wet year lays down a wide ring, a dry year lays down a narrow one. Line up enough trees, living ones, dead ones, timber, and old buildings, and you can reconstruct river flow back hundreds of years, long before anyone put a gauge in the water. What the rings said was brutal. Over the long run, the Colorado has typically carried under 14 million acre-feet a year, roughly 30% less than the men in that lodge assumed. And the rings showed something worse than a lower average. They showed droughts lasting decades at a stretch, with flows down at 13 or 14 million recurring across centuries. The 1920s were not the normal state of the Colorado River. They were an anomaly, and the entire legal architecture of the American Southwest was poured on top of the anomaly. Now add the line item nobody wrote into the ledger at all: evaporation. The river is stored in 2 enormous reservoirs in a desert under open sky. Roughly 13% of the Colorado evaporates every single year. It is not diverted. It is not drunk. Nobody wastes it. It simply leaves. And there is one more claim on the water that most American coverage of this story skips entirely because it is on the other side of a border. Under a treaty signed in 1944, the United States is committed to delivering 1.5 million acre-feet a year to Mexico. That is not charity, and it is not optional. It is a binding international obligation, and it sits in the same queue as everything else. So run the arithmetic. Promises of about 17 million, a river that historically delivers about 14, 13% of that gone into the air, and a treaty obligation on the end. The Colorado River has been overpromised for the entire modern history of the American West. Drought did not create that shortfall. Drought only revealed it. If you want the physical proof of the gap, it is at the bottom of the map. The Colorado's natural end is the Gulf of California. It ran there for 6 million years through a delta the size of a small country. It does not get there anymore. In most years, the river is entirely consumed before it reaches the sea. Every drop spoken for, diverted, and gone. The last stretch is dry riverbed. A river that no longer reaches the ocean is not a river in a drought. It is a river that has been fully allocated. And there is one more thing about that room in 1922, which is going to matter enormously by the end of this film. There are 30 federally recognized tribal nations in this basin. Between them, they hold rights and claims to at least a quarter of the river's annual flow. A quarter. And not one of them was at the table. Their rights were not abolished. Under American law, they are exceptionally strong, and many are exceptionally old, which, in a first-in-time system, is the most valuable property a claim can have. They were simply left as a blank space in the accounts. Remember that blank space. In 2026, it is the single most contested thing on this river. By the 1960s, Arizona had a problem that was very easy to state and very hard to solve. The Colorado runs along its western border. Almost nobody in Arizona lives there. Phoenix and Tucson sit inland, an open desert, pumping groundwater out from underneath themselves and watching the water table fall year after year. What Arizona wanted was a canal. 336 miles of concrete, lifting river water up out of the valley and carrying it across the state to where the people actually were. It would be one of the largest and most expensive water projects ever attempted in the United States, and it needed an act of Congress, which meant it needed California. California had more members of Congress than every other basin state combined, and California had no interest whatsoever in helping a neighbor draw on water it considered spoken for. In 1963, the Supreme Court had already settled how much of the lower river each state could claim. Arizona won that case. But winning a number on paper is not the same as being able to move the water. For that, you need the canal, and for the canal, you need Congress, and Congress meant California. So in 1968, Congress authorized the Central Arizona Project, and Arizona paid for it with the only currency it had left: priority. Arizona agreed that the water in its new canal would sit at the back of the queue. In a shortage, that canal goes to zero before California loses a single acre-foot of its 4.4 million. Read that again, because it is the reason the news you will see this winter looks the way it does. The fastest-growing state in the region, the one that built its entire modern economy on that canal, deliberately signed for the weakest claim on the river. In writing, in exchange for the concrete, and everyone in the room understood the trade. The reasoning was that shortages were a distant theoretical problem and a canal was an immediate concrete one. You take the certain thing, and here is the part almost nobody reports when they cover a Colorado River shortage. When you read this winter that Arizona is being cut harder than California, it will be framed as a fight, a dispute, a negotiation that Arizona lost. It is not. It is a contract being performed exactly as written by people honoring a deal their grandparents signed on purpose. The water researcher Brad Udall, whose own father and uncle were part of the administration that signed it off, has since described the outcome bluntly. California effectively owns the rights to Arizona's canal water. For half a century, it did not matter, because the river ran high enough that the bottom of the queue was never tested. In 2021, it was tested. The federal government declared the first official shortage in the river's history, and it has been tested every year since. Now, here is why I am telling you this as a money story rather than a weather story. Nothing about the 1968 decision was about hydrology. It was a negotiation over an asset between two parties with very unequal bargaining power, in which the weaker party accepted a subordinated position in order to obtain financing for infrastructure. That is a debt structure. That is precisely what it is. Arizona took the junior tranche, and in 2027, exactly as the documents always said it would, The junior tranche takes the loss. Most people, picturing a water crisis in the American West, picture a city, a sprinkler on a lawn, a swimming pool, a fountain outside a hotel. Those images are not wrong exactly, they are just extraordinarily small. In March of 2024, a team of researchers led by Brian Richter published what they described as the first complete accounting of where the water in this river actually goes. Everything, farms, cities, industry, exports out of the basin, Mexico, the environment, and reservoir evaporation, all of it in one set of books, and one number in it deserves to be far more famous than it is. Crops grown to feed cattle consume 32% of all the water taken from the Colorado River. One crop does most of that: alfalfa. More than 5 million acre-feet a year on its own, 26% of the entire river. Now hold that against the other number. Every city, every business, every factory, and every home in the whole basin added together about 3.5 million acre-feet. 18%. Cattle feed drinks close to twice what all 40 million people drink. Alfalfa is a green leafy hay. It is not glamorous, and almost nobody outside farming ever thinks about it. It is fed to dairy cows and beef cattle to make milk and meat. It also has an unusual property. You can cut it several times in a season, which means it drinks all year long in a desert under sun that does not stop. In the upper basin, cattle feed crops account for around 90% of all agricultural water use. Not a slice of it, almost all of it. So when you read that the Colorado is running dry, understand what the water is actually doing. Most of it is not in anybody's shower. It is standing in a field, growing feed so that an animal somewhere else can eat. I want to be careful here, because this is the point where this story usually collapses into an argument about farmers, and that is not the argument. The farmers are doing exactly what the system pays them to do. Go back to Chapter 1. Their water is close to free, and their rights are senior. Growing a thirsty crop is not irrational behavior when the water costs you almost nothing, and using less of it earns you nothing either. The incentive is the story, not the farmer. And there is a second reason to be careful, which is that some of this farming is not optional in any sense that matters to you personally. Yuma County, in the far southwestern corner of Arizona, 230,000 acres of farmland. 100% of it irrigated with Colorado River water. Not most, all. And from November through March, when the fields further north are too cold to grow, Yuma produces up to 90% of all the leafy greens eaten in the United States. Lettuce, spinach, broccoli, cauliflower. On the order of 170 million servings of lettuce a day, right through the winter. So, a bagged salad in an American supermarket in January is, quite literally, Colorado River water in a bag, on a shelf, priced at $2. Which is the genuinely uncomfortable shape of this problem. The water that is easiest to argue should be cut. The free water, growing the thirsty crop in the desert, sits in the same irrigation districts as the water growing the country's winter food. There is no clean cut available here. There is only a decision about who takes the loss. And that decision is not being made by an economist or a hydrologist or a court weighing what the water is worth. It is made by the date on a piece of paper. In 2014, a company began sharply expanding an alfalfa operation in a quiet basin in western Arizona called the Reynosa Plain, La Paz County. Very few people, very flat, very dry. The company is Fondo Monte, Arizona. It is a subsidiary of Almarai, one of the largest dairy companies in the Middle East, based in Saudi Arabia. The alfalfa grown on that land is not sold to American farms. It is baled, containerized, and shipped to Saudi Arabia to feed Saudi dairy cows. And the reason it is grown in Arizona rather than in Saudi Arabia is the detail that makes people stop and read the sentence twice. Saudi Arabia restricted this kind of water-intensive fodder farming inside its own borders because the kingdom was draining its own groundwater to do it. So the crop moved. Not the water. You cannot ship groundwater economically anywhere. The crop moved to a place where the water was still there and, crucially, still free. The alfalfa is really just a container. What is being exported is Arizona's aquifer in the form of hay. Now, everything I have described so far is legal. That is the important part, and it is the part people find hardest to believe. Arizona regulates groundwater tightly inside a handful of active management areas around its big cities. Outside those areas, across most of the state's land, pumping is effectively unlimited. If you own the land and you can afford the drill and the diesel, you can take whatever you can reach. There is no meter. There is no cap. Across much of rural Arizona, there is not even a requirement to report what you took. In 2023, Fondomonte pumped roughly 31,000 acre-feet out of the Ranagra Basin. That was more than 81% of all the groundwater taken from that entire basin in that year by anybody. Neighboring wells began to fail, and the land itself began to subside, the ground sinking as the water underneath it is removed, cracking roads and foundations, and it does not come back. Aquifer collapse is permanent. The state did eventually act. In the spring of 2024, the governor of Arizona, Katie Hobbs, canceled Fondomonte's lease in Butler Valley and declined to renew 3 others after an investigation found the company had violated lease terms. But those were leases on state land. On the land Fondomonte owns outright, the pumping remained entirely lawful because there was no law against it. So in December of 2024, the Arizona Attorney General, Chris Mays, tried something that had not really been tried before on groundwater. She sued the company under public nuisance law. Public nuisance is an old and very broad idea that you cannot use your own property in a way that unreasonably harms an entire community. Mays argued that draining a basin and dropping the ground underneath your neighbors is exactly that. It is a workaround. Everybody involved knows it is a workaround. She reached past water law entirely because water law had nothing to say. The company asked a judge to pause the case, arguing that new groundwater protections would resolve the issue anyway. On the 12th of May this year, Judge Scott Minder of the Maricopa County Superior Court refused. Mays said afterwards, and I quote, "My office will keep fighting to protect the people of La Paz County and hold Fondomonte accountable for the public nuisance we allege they have created due to their overuse of groundwater." The case is still live as this film goes out. But notice what it took to get here. To slow down one company draining one basin, a state attorney general had to reach for a centuries-old nuisance doctrine, because in most of Arizona, groundwater is not owned, not metered, and not counted at all. Cibola, Arizona, a tiny farming settlement on the riverbank. A few hundred people, hours from anywhere. In 2013, an investment company called Greenstone bought a farm there. 485 acres for around $9.8 million. It was not, particularly, a farming decision. Attached to that land was an entitlement to Colorado River water, senior, reliable, and, in Arizona, legally transferable to a city if you can get the approvals. In 2018, the town of Queen Creek, a fast-growing suburb on the edge of Phoenix, approving houses faster than it could find water to put in them, agreed to buy that entitlement. Here is the number. If you remember one figure from this entire film, make it this one. Queen Creek paid $24 million for the right to 2,033 acre-feet of water a year. That is about $11,800 per acre-foot. For water which, sitting in an irrigation district a few miles upstream, is priced at around $30, or, as we established in Chapter 1, at nothing at all. Greenstone had bought the land for $9.8 million. It cleared somewhere in the region of $14 million. And the water that had been irrigating 485 acres of desert farmland now supplies roughly 6,100 households. I want to be precise about why this matters, because investors buy farmland is not, by itself, a scandal. What happened at Cibola is that a piece of paper, written into a first-in-time system a century ago and originally attached to a farm, was detached from that farm and sold to a city at several hundred times the price the farm next door pays. That transaction did not create one drop of new water. It moved an entitlement. And in doing so, it established in public what the entitlement is genuinely worth once you stop treating it as a farming input and start treating it as an asset. That is called price discovery. It is the single most consequential thing that can happen to an asset class that has never had a visible price. Because once one town has paid $11,800 an acre-foot, every irrigation district in the basin knows exactly what it is sitting on, and so does everybody else. A New York hedge fund called Water Asset Management has assembled more than 2,500 acres of farmland across the region on essentially this logic. Buy the land, farm it, or lease it back to the farmer, or make the irrigation more efficient. The crop is incidental. The water right is the position. And then, in December of 2020, this went one step further into something that had never existed anywhere before. The Chicago Mercantile Exchange, the same institution where the world trades contracts on corn, crude oil, and live cattle, launched a futures contract on the price of water. The NASDAQ VELUS, California Water Index, ticker NQH20. From that day, from a screen anywhere on Earth, you could take a financial position on what water would cost in California next quarter. In practice, that contract has stayed very thin. Barely anything trades. So this is not, today, a story about speculators cornering the water market. It is something more basic, and I think more important. It is the formal acknowledgement, by the plumbing of global finance itself, that water in the American West now has a price, a forward curve, and a risk that can be sold to somebody else. It was enough to alarm Congress. Senator Elizabeth Warren and Representative Ro Khanna have repeatedly introduced a bill, the Future of Water Act, that would amend commodity law to ban trading water and water rights as futures outright. It has never passed. The market stands, at which point you might reasonably ask who the biggest spender in this market actually is. A hedge fund? A city? A foreign dairy company? None of them. Since 2023, the largest single sum of money paid out over Colorado River water has come from the United States government. And it was not paid to acquire water. It was paid to persuade people not to take water they were already entitled to take for free. Here is how that happened. Facing an emergency on the river, Arizona, California, and Nevada agreed to cut 3 million acre-feet of use through the end of 2026. They did not do it with rationing. They did it with money. Around $1.2 billion of federal funding, largely from the Inflation Reduction Act, paid to farms, cities, and tribes to not use water they were legally entitled to use. The most common price was about $400 an acre-foot. Think about what that establishes. The United States government went into the market as a buyer and set a public price for leaving water in a river. So the ladder is now complete, and every rung of it is real. Nothing if you hold senior agricultural paper. $400 if Washington is paying you not to use it. $500 if you are a city buying through the system. $11,800 if you are a city buying from an investor. The water never changed, only the paper did. Everything I have described has been governed by a set of temporary rules, written in 2007, extended in 2019, always with an expiry date attached. That date is the 31st of December, 2026, a little over 4 months from now. And there was a warning 4 years ago about exactly what would happen if the states did not sort this out themselves. In June of 2022, the Commissioner of the Bureau of Reclamation, Camille Touton, sat in front of a Senate committee and told the 7 states to find between 2 and 4 million acre-feet of cuts within 60 days. And she said this: "It is in our authorities to act unilaterally to protect the system, and we will protect the system." The states missed the deadline. They missed it in 2022, and they kept missing it. For 3 years, the 7 basin states negotiated: Upper Basin, Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, New Mexico; Lower Basin, Arizona, California, Nevada, plus 30 tribal nations and the government of Mexico. They did not reach agreement. They were not close. So on the 31st of July this year, the federal government did the thing Camille Touton said it would do 4 years earlier. It stopped waiting and published its own framework. This is the document, the Post-2026 Operational Guidelines for Lake Powell and Lake Mead, Final Environmental Impact Statement, Bureau of Reclamation. It is public, it is free, and almost nobody outside the water world has read a page of it. So here is what is actually in it. First, it replaces a fixed allocation with a supply-driven one. Releases from Lake Powell can now range anywhere from 5 million acre-feet a year up to 12 million, depending on what is physically in the reservoirs. For comparison, the historic operating norm was 8.23 million. So the plan explicitly contemplates releasing less than 2/3 of the traditional volume and calls that a normal option. Second, it permits shortages in the lower basin of up to 3 million acre-feet, with the preferred framework modeling reductions as deep as 3.6 million across Arizona, California, Nevada, and Mexico. Third, the guidelines will now be set 2 years at a time, out to 2036, instead of being fixed for a decade. Adaptive is the official word, which also means nobody in this basin gets long-term certainty ever again. Fourth, and this is the sharp end, for 2027 and 2028, it adopts the lower basin state's own proposal of 1.25 million acre-feet of cuts. Arizona, 760,000 acre-feet. California, 440,000. Nevada, 50,000. Look at that split again. Arizona takes more than California, despite California holding the substantially larger entitlement, and despite Arizona being the state with less water to begin with. That is 1968 arriving. That is the canal. And the price of the canal, 58 years later, showing up in a federal document as a number. And after 2028, if there is still no consensus, the framework defaults to straight priority-based distribution, which means the queue, which means the dates on the paper decide, with no political negotiation left to soften the edges at all. There is also a hard physical floor underneath all of this, and it is closer than most people realize. Glen Canyon Dam, which holds back Lake Powell, has 8 generators and about 1,300 megawatts of capacity. Roughly 5 million customers across 7 states buy power from it. Those turbines stop working at 3,490 feet of elevation. That level has a name: minimum power pool. 2 days ago, Lake Powell was at 3,519 feet. It is under 30 feet from the point where the dam stops generating electricity. Below that, at around 3,370 feet, is dead pool, the elevation at which water can no longer pass through the dam by gravity at all. At dead pool, Lake Powell stops being a water supply and becomes a puddle behind a wall. The official language around the July decision is, as you would expect, extremely calm. The Secretary of the Interior, Doug Burgum, said the framework, provides the flexibility to respond to changing hydrologic conditions while preserving the opportunity for the basin states to continue working toward durable, consensus-based solutions. Assistant Secretary Andrea Travnicek described it as striking a balance between flexibility and predictability for the Colorado River system that is vital to the 40 million people who rely on it. The states were considerably less calm. The governor of Arizona, Katie Hobbs, said the plan presented unacceptable options that include the federal government forcing Arizona to take the majority of draconian water cutbacks. The 4 Upper Basin governors put out a joint statement saying they were encouraged that new operating guidelines will better reflect existing water supply, which, translated out of diplomacy, means good, the cuts land downstream. And the governor of Nevada, Joe Lombardo, said he would fight against any outcome that imposes unreasonable impacts to our communities. There is one more step to come, and it is the one to watch. Before the 1st of October, the Interior Department has to sign a record of decision, the legally binding version of the plan. That signature is also a starting gun. It is the first moment at which any state can sue the federal government over any of this. Arizona has already retained a law firm, so after 104 years of compacts, treaties, Supreme Court cases, and emergency deals, the most likely next chapter in the story of the Colorado River is another lawsuit about the paper. Which brings us back to the blank space in the accounts. 30 federally recognized tribal nations in this basin, rights and claims to at least a quarter of the river's flow, none of them in the room in 1922. And in a system where the oldest claim wins, tribal claims are very often the oldest claims that exist. Many of them predate every single state in the basin. They should, on the logic of this entire river, be at the very top of the queue. Roughly 1/3 of households on the Navajo Nation still have no running water. Not restricted water, not rationed water, none. People drive 30 miles and more, round trip, to fill containers. Hauling water can cost a family around $600 a month, which is, per gallon, almost certainly more than anybody watching this pays for anything that comes out of a tap. Marilyn Tewa, a member of the Hopi Tribal Council, described the untreated well water she hauls every other day in 5 words. That's what keeps us alive. Crystalline Curley, the speaker of the Navajo Nation Council, put the stakes about as plainly as they can be put. It's just basically turning on the faucet and getting water to boil eggs for your children. The reason for the gap is not that the rights do not exist. It is that most of them have never been legally quantified, turned into a specific number, in a specific court, with specific infrastructure funded to actually deliver it. A right you cannot measure is a right you cannot use. And a right you cannot use is, in practice, water that somebody downstream is quietly already drinking. There is a settlement designed to fix exactly this. The Northeastern Arizona Indian Water Rights Settlement, the Navajo Nation, the Hopi Tribe, and the San Juan Southern Paiute Tribe. It would be the largest tribal water rights settlement in American history. Roughly $5 billion of federal money for pipes, pumps, and treatment plants. Firm, quantified allocations, including 44,700 acre-feet a year of Arizona's Upper Basin water. All 4 Upper Basin states, Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming, have opposed it. And their stated objection is the exact thing this entire film has been circling for 40 minutes. Their concern is not that the tribes would drink the water. It is that the settlement would allow the Navajo and the Hopi to lease water off the reservation, to sell it downstream, to Phoenix, to Los Angeles. They are worried about the precedent, because if a tribal nation holding a senior, quantified, century-old right can sell that water to a city, then the market value of every senior right in this basin becomes visible and tradable all at once. The Cibola sale showed what a single entitlement was worth when somebody finally put it on the market. $11,800 an acre-foot. Now imagine that same price discovery running across a quarter of the Colorado River. Navajo Nation President Boo Nygren has responded to how his people's claim gets handled in these negotiations with one sentence: "We shouldn't be punished for being in two basins." So here is where we actually stand. In August of 2026, the oldest claims on the river belong to people who largely cannot use them. The newest infrastructure belongs to a state that signed away its priority to get the concrete poured. The cheapest water in the basin, free water, goes to the users holding the strongest paper. And the reason 4 states are blocking the largest tribal water settlement in American history is that honoring the oldest injustice on this river would finally reveal the price of everything else on it. One last thing about Rio Verde foothills. The 2,000 households at the start of this film buying water by the truckload with quarters, they got their water back. Later in 2023, the governor signed a bill, Scottsdale approved a deal, and the deliveries restarted. It took a state legislature and a governor's signature to get running water to 2,000 houses 40 minutes outside Phoenix. Not a drought, not a pipeline, a statute, because the problem was never that the water was gone. The problem was that none of it belonged to them. I set out at the beginning to answer one question: who owns America's water? The honest answer is that nobody owns the water. Everybody owns paper. And the paper was issued against a river that was measured during the wettest 20 years in 5 centuries. Every argument you are going to see about the Colorado over the next 4 months, the lawsuits, the governors, the emergency declarations, the photographs of white rock around a shrinking lake, is an argument about which sheets of that paper get honored when the arithmetic finally refuses. And if you want to know how it is going, do not watch the reservoir level. The news will show you that, and it only tells you about the weather. Watch the price. Watch what a city pays for an acre-foot. That number is the market's honest opinion of how this ends, and it has only ever moved in one direction. If this is the kind of thing you want explained properly, the mechanism, the documents, the actual numbers rather than the drone shots, then subscribing genuinely does help this channel keep making them. There is another film waiting on the same fight, being fought right now over electricity. Thanks for watching.